It was the evening of February 23, 1989, when the lights of Honolulu International Airport shimmered across the runways like a necklace of gold against the dark Pacific night. The air was calm, the weather clear, and United Airlines Flight 811 stood proudly on the tarmac, preparing for its long journey across the ocean. The Boeing 47122, registration number N4713U, gleamed beneath the floodlights, a symbol of American aviation power and reliability. It was a routine flight, one that connected continents, carrying passengers from Hawaii to Auckland, New Zealand, before continuing on to Sydney, Australia. For most aboard, it was just another leg of travel, some returning home, others visiting family, and a few embarking on business trips that would take them far from home. Inside the terminal, boarding announcements echoed softly through the hallways as travelers made their way to Gate 9. United Airlines Flight 811, scheduled to depart at 1:52 a.m., was a familiar route to many frequent flyers. The Boeing 747, nicknamed Friendship, was one of the most trusted aircraft in service. With its four massive Pratt & Whitney JT90 engines and a wingspan of nearly 200 feet, it was designed for long-range travel across oceans. At this late hour, the aircraft crew moved with quiet precision, performing their pre-flight checks with the kind of disciplined calm that only experience can bring. In the cockpit sat Captain David Cronin, a veteran pilot with more than 28,000 flight hours to his name. This flight, in fact, was intended to be one of his last before retirement. Alongside him were First Officer Al Slater and Flight Engineer Randall Thomas, both highly trained and familiar with the 747's complex systems. Together, they formed a team whose skill and communication would later prove vital in the most harrowing moments of their careers. Down below, ground engineers worked through the night, verifying that all systems were operational and that the cargo hold was properly secured. The atmosphere in the passenger cabin was peaceful. Families settled into their seats, adjusting pillows and blankets, while the low hum of the air conditioning filled the aisles. The flight attendants, led by Purser Karen Burns, moved gracefully through the cabin, offering smiles and greetings. There were 337 passengers on board, representing a mix of nationalities: Americans, New Zealanders, Australians, Japanese tourists, and a few from other parts of the world. Among them were military personnel heading home, vacationers returning from Hawaiian holidays, and corporate travelers chasing time zones. No one could have imagined that this ordinary night flight would soon turn into one of aviation's most terrifying ordeals. Flight 811's route was a well-traveled one for United Airlines. The 747 would depart Honolulu, climb steadily to cruising altitude, and then follow a path over the Pacific Ocean toward New Zealand, a distance of more than 3,800 miles. This transoceanic corridor was carefully monitored through radio communication with air traffic control centers, using long-range frequencies due to the lack of radar coverage over vast oceanic areas. For the first 2 hours of flight, the aircraft would remain within communication range of Honolulu before switching to high-frequency channels for oceanic control. Pilots operating such routes were trained for extended operations without visual landmarks, a dance of precision, trust, and technical reliability. The aircraft's massive fuselage was divided into several decks and compartments. Below the passenger cabin sat the cargo bays, pressurized and reinforced areas designed to carry luggage, mail, and freight. These compartments were equipped with large outward, opening cargo doors that allowed ground crews to load and unload containers efficiently. Each door was secured with a series of electrical and mechanical locks, engineered to withstand the enormous pressure differences between the inside and outside of the plane at cruising altitude. On Flight 811, those systems had passed standard inspection, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As the final checks were completed, the cockpit came alive with coordinated rhythm. Switches were flipped, gauges glowed, and the sound of turbine engines rising to life echoed through the night. Captain Cronin's voice carried through the intercom with calm authority. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're expecting a smooth flight tonight, clear skies most of the way to Auckland, Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight with United." His tone was warm, steady, and confident, exactly the kind of reassurance passengers appreciated when flying across the dark expanse of the Pacific. At precisely 1:52 a.m., Flight 8011 began its takeoff roll on runway 80R. The engines roared to full power, their thunder vibrating across the airport grounds as the jumbo jet accelerated past 150 knots. Inside, passengers felt the familiar pressure pushing them back into their seats, some closing their eyes as the aircraft lifted gracefully into the night sky. From the cockpit, the lights of Honolulu faded behind as the city disappeared into a sea of darkness. The stars above were bright and unbroken, mirrored faintly by the ocean below. The aircraft climbed through 10,000 feet, then 20,000, leaving the island chain far behind. For the flight crew, everything appeared routine. The cockpit instruments glowed in shades of green and amber, indicating stable systems and smooth performance. Airspeed, altitude, and fuel flow were all within normal parameters. The crew reviewed their climb checklist, made their standard radio calls, and adjusted heading toward their assigned route. Flight attendants began light cabin service, offering water and refreshments to passengers still awake. Others had already reclined their seats and drifted into slumber, unaware of what fate was quietly building beneath their feet. The Boeing 747 was a technological marvel of its era. Designed to carry hundreds of passengers safely over long distances, it featured redundant systems, multiple backups for hydraulic, electrical, and pressurization components. Yet beneath all that engineering sophistication, a single point of weakness still lurked: the design of the cargo door's locking mechanism. The door on the forward right cargo bay was secured by latches controlled by an electrical actuator. Once the door was closed and locked, indicator lights in the cockpit confirmed its status. To the flight crew, a green light meant the door was sealed and safe. But in reality, under certain circumstances, the door could appear locked even when the internal locking cams were not fully engaged. It was a flaw known within engineering circles, but one that had not yet revealed its full potential for disaster. As Flight 8011 leveled off at around 22,000 feet, the night outside remained calm. The aircraft cruised smoothly through the stratosphere, its navigation lights tracing a faint red and green glimmer against the stars. The passengers, cocooned in the safety of the cabin, chatted softly, read books, or watched the faint glow of movie screens flickering ahead. In the galley, flight attendants prepared to serve late night meals, moving in synchronized rhythm through narrow aisles. The crew was relaxed but alert, following every protocol with practiced precision. At this stage of the flight, the aircraft was still relatively close to Hawaii, approximately 100 miles south of the islands. It was the safest portion of the oceanic journey, a time when the crew could still rely on radar contact and radio communication with Honolulu Center. There were no signs of turbulence, no warning lights, no reason for alarm. The flight engineer monitored pressurization systems, fuel flow, and engine performance. Everything appeared nominal. But deep within the lower deck, the electrical circuits controlling the cargo door had already begun to malfunction. No one aboard could sense what was happening below. The pressure differential between the cabin and the outside atmosphere was steadily increasing as the aircraft climbed, exerting tremendous force on every panel and seal of the fuselage. In the forward cargo bay, microscopic metal fatigue in the door's locking pins began to combine with an electrical short that would soon prove catastrophic. A chain of events was silently aligning, one that would challenge every aspect of human skill and mechanical design. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Cronin leaned back slightly, scanning the instrument panel. His career had been filled with countless flights like this, routine crossings, hours of calm vigilance broken only by occasional radio chatter. He was known among colleagues for his calm demeanor, his focus, and his ability to make precise decisions even under stress. For him, this was supposed to be one of his final international flights before retirement. A quiet farewell to the skies that had defined his life. The irony, though cruel, was that this very flight would etch his name into aviation history forever. The Pacific stretched endlessly below, black and silent. Outside, the air temperature hovered around -50 degrees Celsius. Inside, the cabin remained warm and comfortable, a fragile bubble of human life hurtling through the darkness. Every passenger trusted the unseen network of systems, the hundreds of mechanical components that made flight possible. And yet, in that same moment, one of those very systems was on the verge of failing in the most violent way imaginable. The overview of Flight 811's mission that night was straightforward: depart Honolulu, fly southeast toward the equator, and land in Auckland approximately 8.5 hours later. From there, the aircraft would continue on to Sydney after refueling and crew change. The route took the plane over the open ocean for nearly its entire duration, far from land or emergency diversion points. In such flights, safety was not just about navigation but also about redundancy. Every backup system, every inspection mattered. That night, all checklists had been completed, and the plane was deemed airworthy by all standards. But even perfect paperwork cannot foresee a mechanical flaw hidden deep within the structure of steel and circuits. As the aircraft continued climbing toward its assigned altitude of 23,000 feet, the cabin lights dimmed slightly to allow passengers to rest. The air hummed softly with the sound of engines and the distant whir of air conditioning vents. A few passengers looked out through the oval windows at the faint curve of the Earth's horizon. For them, the scene was serene: an endless sky, distant stars, and the gentle rhythm of flight. In the cockpit, the flight crew prepared for their next radio contact, exchanging brief, efficient words as they monitored the aircraft's climb performance. Every flight has its story, a pattern of routine moments that seem ordinary until they become extraordinary. For Flight 811, the first phase of that story was peaceful, steady, and precise. The aircraft had left the safety of the islands and committed itself to the void of the Pacific, its engines humming faithfully through the darkness. But within that calm, the seeds of disaster were already sown. A small misalignment in the cargo door's electrical circuit, a tiny gap in the locking mechanism, imperceptible to the naked eye, would soon unleash forces beyond human control. Yet, this first phase also captures something profound about flight itself: the trust between man and machine, between crew and passenger, between training and instinct. At that moment, no one aboard Flight 811 doubted that the 747 would carry them safely across the ocean. The professionalism of the pilots, the experience of the cabin crew, and the reputation of Boeing engineering gave everyone a sense of security. The night sky, vast and silent, offered no hint of the chaos that would soon erupt. In aviation, every journey begins with trust: the belief that a machine built by thousands of hands, maintained by countless eyes, and flown by trained professionals will fulfill its purpose. Flight 811 embodied that faith. It was an international connection between people and continents, a testament to how far humanity had come in mastering the skies. But it was also a reminder that even the most sophisticated systems can falter. The journey, that began as a simple, overnight flight, would soon become a battle between human courage and mechanical failure, a test of will and survival that would be studied for decades to come. As the aircraft leveled off, the lights of Honolulu had vanished completely. The crew monitored instruments, passengers slept peacefully, and all seemed perfectly normal. The Boeing 747 continued to climb gently into the dark, carrying 355 souls on a voyage that would soon turn into a story of resilience, heroism, and the fine line between routine and catastrophe. The great jet moved like a ghost across the Pacific, its four engines humming with a steady vibration that felt almost musical against the silence of the night. Inside the cockpit of United Airlines Flight 811, Captain David Cronin and his crew maintained their quiet rhythm of checks and calls. The digital displays glowed softly, showing altitude, speed, and course alignment, all within normal range. The aircraft had leveled at roughly 23,000 feet, its nose pointed southeast toward the empty stretch of ocean that lay between Hawaii and the far islands of Polynesia. To the flight crew, everything seemed as it should be. The Boeing 747 was in perfect trim, the autopilot engaged, and the cabin pressurization system holding steady. Captain Cronin adjusted his headset and spoke with Honolulu Center, confirming position and altitude before the aircraft switched to high-frequency oceanic channels. The sound of static filled the radio for a brief moment before the connection stabilized. United 811, radar contact lost. Report position every 10 degrees. The controller's voice crackled through the frequency. Cronin acknowledged calmly, his tone clipped and precise. It was the standard procedure for long-haul transoceanic routes where radar could no longer follow them. Once they crossed that invisible boundary, they were alone in the night sky. A self-contained world of metal, fuel, and human lives, guided only by instruments and trust. Behind the cockpit door, the atmosphere was peaceful. The faint aroma of coffee drifted from the galley as flight attendants prepared trays for the first service of the flight. The seatbelt signs were off, and passengers stretched their legs. A couple from New Zealand chatted quietly about their vacation in Hawaii, still wearing leis around their necks. Nearby, a businessman typed notes on a small travel notebook, his pen scratching lightly against the paper. The cabin was dimly lit, bathed in the soft glow of reading lights and the low hum of the engines that lulled people into sleep. Far below, the Pacific shimmered faintly in the moonlight. From 30,000 feet, the ocean looked endless, a shifting canvas of black and silver, broken only by the occasional reflection of clouds. The aircraft flew straight and true, a steel arrow cutting through the heavens. It was a picture of calm efficiency, the kind of serenity that defines long-range aviation. Yet, deep within the structure of the airplane, the seeds of danger still waited in silence. The forward cargo bay of the Boeing 747 sat just beneath the first-class cabin. Inside it, containers of luggage and freight were locked in place, secured by the large outward-opening cargo door on the right side. That door was built with a complex locking system, mechanical latches and electrical actuators designed to hold against immense pressure. Each latch was supposed to rotate and lock into place when the door was sealed, and a series of electrical circuits sent a signal to the cockpit to confirm a safe closure. On that particular night, the indicator light on the flight engineer's panel showed green door secure. No one had reason to doubt it, but the flaw that haunted the Boeing 747's cargo door design was subtle and dangerous. Years earlier, another aircraft of similar design had suffered a cargo door failure during flight, though the plane had managed to land safely. Boeing engineers had introduced modifications to strengthen the locking mechanism, but the improvements depended on precise maintenance and inspection. If a cable or switch was even slightly out of alignment, the door could appear locked when it was not fully secured. On Flight 811, an electrical short in the door's wiring, invisible to the naked eye, was ready to trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. At roughly 2 o'clock in the morning, most passengers had fallen asleep. The cabin was dark, and the rhythmic hum of the engines created a strange sense of comfort. The flight attendants moved quietly, checking seat belts, securing galley items, and preparing to rest. In the cockpit, Captain Cronin reviewed fuel calculations with his flight engineer. Everything was routine. The aircraft weighed over 600,000 pounds, loaded with passengers, luggage, and enough fuel to cross the Pacific with reserves to spare. Outside, the temperature at altitude was freezing, nearly -50 degrees Celsius. The skin of the aircraft contracted slightly from the cold, but such changes were accounted for in the design. The crew could not hear the metal expanding and contracting, nor could they feel the minute vibrations running through the fuselage. The airplane was alive in its own mechanical way, a balance of pressure, airflow, and stress distributed across thousands of rivets and panels. It was a marvel of human engineering, but also a reminder that perfection in flight is always a delicate balance between physics and precision. At 22,000 feet, the differential between the cabin's internal pressure and the outside air reached its peak. The structure of the fuselage held back a force of several thousand pounds per square foot, an invisible wall separating life, supporting air from the vacuum of high altitude. The cargo door was one of the most vulnerable parts of that wall, and any failure there would unleash an unstoppable burst of energy. Still, inside the cabin, laughter and whispers continued. No one imagined that the thin metal skin beneath their feet could become the gateway to disaster. From a purely operational standpoint, Flight 811's route across the Pacific was simple but unforgiving. The path followed a great circle course, the shortest distance between Hawaii and New Zealand. Along that invisible line, there were no major diversion airports for hundreds of miles. Pilots flying such routes trained specifically for oceanic emergencies, engine failures, decompression, medical events, and fire scenarios. They were drilled repeatedly on how to handle the unexpected. For Captain Cronin and his crew, these procedures were second nature. Every move was practiced, every possible outcome anticipated. What no one could prepare for completely, however, was the shock of sudden structural failure in midair. As the minutes passed, the cabin pressure indicator began to show minor fluctuations. Nothing alarming, just subtle readings that the flight engineer attributed to routine air conditioning adjustments. He noted them mentally and kept his eyes on the gauges. A few rows behind the cockpit bulkhead, passengers shifted in their seats, unaware of the faint creaks and groans coming from the fuselage below. The Boeing 747 was a large aircraft, and such noises were common as it adjusted to altitude. The truth was that the very structure that held them safe was beginning to feel unnatural stress around the cargo door frame. Captain Cronin's mind, as always, remained on the details. At 66 years old, he was one of United's most experienced captains. His calm voice and measured instructions created an atmosphere of trust on the flight deck. As the aircraft maintained level cruise, he briefly discussed weather patterns ahead with First Officer Slater. Light winds, no turbulence, and clear skies. An ideal flight. The routine was comforting, the predictability almost soothing. Yet even as the aircraft moved forward, time was ticking toward the moment when calm would turn into chaos. Meanwhile, in the lower deck, the wiring that controlled the cargo door latches was still energized. A small short circuit caused by chafed insulation began to send a false signal through the actuator motor. The mechanical latches, already weakened by slight misalignment, began to twitch microscopically against the pressure. The entire door assembly bore the brunt of thousands of pounds pushing outward. Then, in less than a second, a surge of electrical current triggered the actuator motor, forcing it to move in the wrong direction. The locking pins disengaged. What followed would soon become one of the most violent decompressions ever recorded in aviation history. But before that fateful moment, the overview of the flight still held its peaceful rhythm. To understand the enormity of what was about to happen, one must grasp the atmosphere of normalcy that preceded it. The crew followed every checklist, the passengers sat in quiet trust, and the aircraft systems gave no clear warning. Even the smallest blip on an instrument panel could not have predicted the explosive release of energy that was seconds away. This was the reality of air travel, a world where safety is maintained through layers of technology and training, yet one tiny fault can slip through unseen. At 2:09 a.m. the cockpit voice recorder captured the last moments of calm. The crew discussed minor details of their climb and cruise configuration. Then came a sound, a sudden thud, followed by a deep, tearing roar that shook the entire aircraft. The forward cargo door had blown outward, ripping away a section of the fuselage along the right-hand side. The decompression was instantaneous. The cabin floor buckled upward, oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Passengers in rows 8 through 12, seated directly above the cargo hold, were exposed to the full force of the blast. 8 of them were ejected from the aircraft in an instant, vanishing into the night sky. The cockpit windows fogged from the sudden pressure drop, alarms blared, and the crew instinctively grabbed oxygen masks. From that point onward, Flight 811 would no longer be a routine journey. It would become a fight for control, a test of courage and professionalism that would echo through aviation history. The route that had begun so smoothly now turned into a path of survival, every mile a battle against gravity, damage, and time. The overview of the flight, from takeoff in Honolulu to this moment of chaos, would later serve as a study in both engineering vulnerability and human resilience. In reconstructing those first 40 minutes of the flight, investigators and historians found that everything up to the explosion had followed procedure perfectly. There had been no indication of error, no sign of negligence. The crew's adherence to protocol, the aircraft's performance, and even the weather were ideal. This made the event even more haunting, a reminder that sometimes catastrophe lies hidden beneath a mask of perfection. For the passengers, those initial moments of the journey were filled with the gentle monotony of long-haul travel. They would remember the kindness of the crew, the calm takeoff, and the feeling of safety. None could have known how close they were to disaster. Yet in the larger scope of aviation, Flight 8 and 11's journey across the Pacific represented more than just a tragic accident. It symbolized the immense distances that modern flight bridged, the link between islands, nations, and lives separated by oceans. The route from Honolulu to Auckland was a line connecting families, economies, and dreams. Every flight that crossed it carried not only passengers but also stories, emotions, and trust in the machines that defy gravity. Flight NLL's path through the night embodied that faith, and its breakdown would teach future generations of engineers the cost of overlooking even the smallest flaw. In later years, when documentaries revisited that night, the first segment always captured the same image, the Boeing 747 rising into a moonlit sky, majestic and calm, carrying hundreds of lives toward the horizon. It was a moment frozen in time, before the chaos, before the damage, before the sound of tearing metal and screaming wind. The overview of that peaceful beginning, with its calm voices and soft cabin lights, became the stark contrast to the horror that followed. It illustrated the fine line between safety and catastrophe, a line that aviation strives constantly to strengthen. Flight 811's first phase remains a study in perfection meeting imperfection. Every switch flipped correctly, every system checked, every crew member performing exactly as trained. The aircraft flew its planned route over the Pacific, aligning with navigation points as it always had. The passengers trusted in a world built on precision, yet hidden in the circuits of a cargo door actuator. A tiny electrical arc waited to betray that trust. The story of that flight, from its calm departure to its violent mid-air failure, began not with chaos but with routine, not with fear but with confidence. In a sense, this overview is the most haunting part of the story, because it shows that danger often hides behind normality. It shows that the very moments we feel most safe can be the prelude to disaster. But it also reveals the extraordinary capability of human beings to respond when that illusion shatters. Flight 811's route was one of endurance, connection, and routine. Yet within that ordinary journey lay the seeds of one of aviation's defining lessons. That safety is not a static achievement, but a living pursuit, built through vigilance, humility, and the courage to learn from tragedy. As the aircraft continued its flight through the dark Pacific, the passengers still asleep, the crew still watching their instruments, everything seemed calm once more. But beneath that calm, invisible pressures were building. The overview of Flight 811's route and mission would end at that precise moment, just before the explosion, when silence still reigned and the stars reflected peacefully in the ocean below. It was the last instant of normal flight, the final breath before the storm. In that fragile pause, humanity's mastery of the skies and the unpredictability of fate met in perfect balance, a balance that would, within seconds, be torn apart. The night sky over the Pacific was silent, vast, and endless. United Airlines Flight 811, heavy with fuel and gliding at 23,000 feet, moved like a gleaming arrow through the darkness. Inside the cabin, calm still reigned. Passengers slept, the hum of the engines filled the air, and the soft lights gave the space a peaceful glow. Yet somewhere deep within the body of the aircraft, below layers of aluminum skin and insulation, something invisible had already begun to stir. A sequence of small mechanical and electrical failures that would soon explode with terrifying force. To understand what happened next, one must picture the Boeing 747 in its simplest anatomy, a colossal pressurized shell, its skin stretched tight by the difference between the warm, breathable air inside and the freezing vacuum outside. At cruising altitude, that pressure difference reached nearly 9 pounds per square inch, multiplied across every square foot of metal. Each latch, rivet, and seal carried its share of that burden. Among them all, the forward cargo door bore a particularly heavy strain. Unlike passenger doors that swing inward and lock against the cabin's internal pressure, the cargo door on the 747 opened outward. It was held closed by a system of rotating latches powered by an electric actuator and secured by mechanical locking pins. When everything worked, it was flawless. When one component faltered, the results were catastrophic. The door on Flight 811 had been inspected before departure. Ground engineers had seen nothing unusual. The indicator on the flight engineers panel had shown green secure. But inside the actuator motor housing, wires that carried electrical current to control the latches had frayed slightly over time. Each pressurization cycle, each takeoff and landing, had flexed those wires until the insulation wore thin. Now, at altitude, cold air and vibration made the metal inside them contract and expand. The door's motor still carried a residual charge, its relays alive even though the handle in the cargo bay sat locked. Up in the cockpit, Captain Cronin and his crew had just settled into the routine of cruise. They were about 100 miles south of Honolulu, past the point of radar contact, reporting by radio to oceanic control. The sound of static filled their headsets as they acknowledged their position. Below them, the vast darkness of the Pacific stretched unbroken. First Officer Slater adjusted the autopilot, Flight Engineer Thomas logged fuel readings, and Captain Cronin glanced across his instruments. Altitude steady, speed nominal, pressurization normal. There was nothing to suggest that a single switch, somewhere in the web of electrical circuits, was preparing to betray them. Inside the cabin, the mood remained gentle. A few passengers read quietly beneath reading lights. Others slept with blankets drawn up to their chins. Flight attendants whispered as they collected service trays. The steady hum of the engines was the soundtrack of calm. In the forward galley, Purser Karen Burns poured coffee for a colleague, unaware that directly beneath their feet, metal parts less than an inch thick stood between order and chaos. At precisely 2:08 a.m., the first sign appeared, so faint that no one noticed. The actuator motor inside the cargo door twitched. A tiny electrical arc jumped between exposed contacts. The motor began to rotate a fraction of a turn in the reverse direction, just enough to pull the latch cams slightly open. The door's external latch handle, locked and recessed, remained unmoved, but inside, the hooks that clamped the door against the fuselage shifted. They disengaged only a fraction of an inch, but under the enormous outward pressure of the cabin air, that was enough. The structure began to flex. The Boeing 747 skin creaked, a sound lost beneath the rumble of engines. In the forward cargo bay, the metal frame around the door started to bow outward. Sensors registered the strain but had no connection to the cockpit. There was no alarm to warn the crew. Within seconds, the door's locks failed completely. The motor, still receiving the false signal, continued to rotate, driving the mechanism to the open position. And then, in an instant, the full force of 23,000 feet of cabin pressure found its escape. The explosion was deafening. It tore through the night like a cannon blast. The forward cargo door blew outward, ripping away a section of the fuselage nearly 20 feet long and 10 feet high. The surrounding structure fractured, peeling back like a tin can. The sudden decompression was violent beyond imagination. A wall of air shot from the cabin toward the opening with the speed of an explosion. The floor of the passenger deck above the cargo hold buckled upward. Rows 8 through 12, seated just over the door, disintegrated in the blast. 8 passengers were sucked from their seats and vanished instantly into the freezing void. In the cockpit, alarms screamed. The cabin altitude warning horn blared a continuous wail. Papers and manuals flew into the air as the crew grabbed their oxygen masks. Captain Cronin's headset ripped away. He snatched it back, forcing the mask over his face. Through the roar, he heard the unmistakable thunder of rushing wind. The air temperature plummeted. Frost formed on the cockpit windows. Instrument needles flickered wildly as the electrical system struggled to stabilize after the shock. In the passenger cabin, chaos erupted. The pressure change tore ceiling panels loose and shattered interior fixtures. Oxygen masks fell from the overhead compartments, swinging violently in the freezing blast. Passengers gasped for air, their ears and lungs burning from the sudden decompression. Those far from the rupture screamed and clung to armrests. Those near it never had a chance. The noise was beyond comprehension. A hurricane trapped inside a steel shell. Within seconds, 2 of the aircraft's 4 engines began to fail. Debris from the explosion, shards of metal, insulation, and fragments of luggage had been sucked into the right side engines 3 and 4, causing surges and flameouts. The airplane lurched violently to the right. Alarms multiplied, engine warnings, hydraulic cautions, pressurization failures. In the cockpit, Captain Cronin fought to regain control, shouting over the noise to his crew. "We've lost number 3. Number 4's gone." First Officer Slater reached for the throttles, pulling back power on the damaged engines. The 747 shuddered but responded. Amid the chaos, the flight attendants sprang into action. Despite the freezing wind howling through the forward cabin, they tried to reach passengers, pulling oxygen masks over faces, guiding those still conscious to stay low. The front of the cabin was a scene of devastation, seats ripped from the floor, walls gone, wires hanging loose. The thin blue light from emergency lamps flickered across faces pale with shock. Back in the cockpit, the crew worked by instinct. Years of training now took over in seconds. Flight engineer Thomas managed to stabilize electrical power by isolating damaged circuits. Captain Cronin began an emergency descent, banking the aircraft slightly and pointing its nose downward to bring it into thicker air where passengers could breathe. Emergency descent, going down to 10,000 feet, he called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. But the sequence that led to that decision had unfolded in mere moments. From the first electrical spark to the full rupture of the fuselage, less than a minute had passed. The forces involved were unimaginable. The pressure inside the aircraft equal to tens of thousands of pounds pushing outward on every surface. Once the cargo door gave way, the pressure differential exploded outward at supersonic speed. The deck above fractured, creating a direct path from the cabin to the open sky. Investigators later calculated that the door, weighing several hundred pounds, had been hurled outward with enough force to shear metal beams thicker than a man's wrist. The fuselage skin tore away in long, jagged strips, exposing insulation and wiring. The structural damage extended along the right-hand side, weakening the area near the wing root. The loss of 2 engines only added to the danger. Yet through it all, the pilots maintained enough control to prevent the aircraft from entering a spin. The physical sequence of the failure was only part of the story. The psychological impact on the crew and passengers was just as intense. For those awake in the cabin, the blast was instantaneous. A sound like thunder, followed by a rush of air so strong it tore shoes and clothing away. The sudden darkness, the freezing wind, and the smell of jet fuel created sensory overload. People clung to each other, their bodies pressed by the wind, eyes wide in disbelief. The flight attendants shouted instructions they could barely hear themselves. Every second felt stretched into eternity. For Captain Cronin, the cockpit became a battlefield of alarms and warning lights. He had to differentiate between critical failures and false readings. With oxygen masks secured, he communicated through hand signals and brief shouts. The aircraft was losing altitude rapidly, but it needed to descend fast enough for survival without overstressing the damaged structure. Too much speed could tear it apart, too little could stall it. It was a razor-thin margin between control and destruction. The entire event, from the first electrical anomaly to full decompression, represented a chain of failures that began years before, in design and maintenance documents. Boeing's earlier advisories about cargo door malfunctions had been partially implemented, but not universally enforced. United Airlines had followed required procedures, but the flaw itself was hidden deep within the mechanical heart of the door system. It was a reminder that even the most advanced aircraft in the world could fall victim to a detail overlooked. A wire misrouted, a latch unchecked. From a technical standpoint, what occurred was a perfect storm of mechanical vulnerability and environmental stress. The door's electrical system, exposed to cycles of pressurization and moisture, degraded over time. A short circuit allowed the door motor actuator to reverse under load, unlocking latches that should have remained sealed. The internal safety locks designed to prevent movement under pressure either failed or were bypassed by the motor's torque. Once the first latch disengaged, the others followed, and the outward pressure did the rest. The suddenness of the event left almost no time for response. Passengers in the affected rows never had a chance to fasten oxygen masks or brace. Their seats, still bolted to the floor, were ripped from the aircraft and hurled into the sky. The cabin's front carpet peeled backward, the air filled with snow, like particles of insulation. The remaining passengers faced a nightmare of noise and freezing air. Yet in the midst of terror, a strange discipline prevailed. People obeyed the attendants' shouted orders, clinging to seats and each other as the aircraft dove toward breathable altitude. As Flight 801 plunged through 15,000 feet, the noise began to subside slightly. The pressure difference lessened, though the hole in the fuselage still yawned wide open. The temperature rose marginally, enough for the crew to breathe more easily once oxygen levels stabilized. Captain Cronin's hands gripped the control yoke tightly, muscles rigid from strain. He leveled the aircraft briefly to assess control response. Despite the loss of 2 engines and major structural damage, the plane still flew, battered but alive. The sequence leading up to that moment was later mapped second by second through the flight data recorder. It revealed how invisible the threat had been. There was no single warning, no human error, no missed checklist. The catastrophe had germinated quietly within the machinery, waiting for the perfect alignment of altitude, pressure, and electrical load. When those variables converged, the system turned on itself. The cargo door, designed to contain pressure, became the point of release. Yet within that mechanical tragedy lay the core of human endurance. Every action taken in those seconds, by pilots, attendants, and even passengers, shaped the outcome that would follow. The chain of events had begun with wires and metal, but it continued with decisions made in panic and clarity alike. It was a collision of technology and instinct, of failure and resilience. As the aircraft stabilized at lower altitude, the night outside remained deceptively calm. Stars still glittered across the horizon, and the ocean below reflected faint moonlight. No one aboard would ever see that night sky the same way again. What had begun as a routine journey was now a desperate mission of survival, and the path that led there, from a simple electrical flicker to a hole torn open by pressure, would forever mark aviation history. The seconds after the explosion felt like hours. The roar inside the aircraft was deafening, an endless scream of wind and metal that drowned every human sound. In the cockpit, Captain David Cronin's hands were locked to the yoke as the 747 shook violently in the thin air. Every muscle in his body tensed against the vibration. The control columns trembled under pressure, the instrument needles flickered erratically, and a strange high-pitched whine came from the right side of the aircraft where 2 engines had been silenced by debris. For an instant, the pilots could not even hear their own voices through the oxygen masks. "Emergency! Decompression!" Cronin managed to shout, his words clipped and distorted through the mask microphone. First Officer Al Slater confirmed, his voice equally strained. Flight Engineer Mark Thomas, his eyes darting across the systems panel, reached for the checklist binder that had blown open from the blast. Loose papers swirled in the air like confetti before being sucked toward the small gaps around the cockpit door. The temperature inside had dropped rapidly, breath turned to mist in front of their faces. They had trained for countless scenarios: engine fires, hydraulic failures, electrical faults, but few situations matched the speed and violence of explosive decompression. The first instinct was survival: oxygen first, communication second, control third. The mind could hardly keep up with the sequence, yet each action was guided by habit forged from repetition. Cronin pressed the push-to-talk switch. Mayday, mayday, mayday. United 811 explosive decompression, descending immediately. The response from Honolulu control was faint, almost lost in static. The crew barely heard it, but they knew the message had gone out. Somewhere below, the radar screens would show their altitude plummeting. Cronin began the descent carefully. Not a dive, but a controlled emergency descent that would trade altitude for oxygen as quickly as the damaged airframe could handle. The aircraft nosed downward through a layer of thin cloud, stars above turning into streaks of white light. Inside the cabin, chaos raged. The front section of the fuselage looked like the inside of a storm. Wind whipped through the gaping hole where rows of seats had been. Electrical wires sparked and flickered, dancing in the darkness. Bits of insulation floated like snow, catching the faint glow of emergency lights. Some passengers sat motionless, stunned into silence. Others screamed or prayed aloud. Those far from the blast clutched their oxygen masks, eyes fixed on the flight attendants moving through the aisles despite the gale. Purser Karen Burns and her colleagues fought to keep order. They crawled along the floor, pulling oxygen masks over faces, shouting simple commands. Put it on, breathe, stay down. Every step forward was met with resistance from the rushing wind. One of them tried to move toward the forward section, but was forced back by the blast of freezing air. It was impossible to go any farther. They could only care for the living where they stood. In the cockpit, the sound of alarms gradually faded into the background of instinctive focus. Cronin's voice grew steadier. He called for the emergency checklist, and Thomas read each step aloud, his gloved finger tracing the printed lines. Pressurization, manual, oxygen, on, engine power, reduce number 3 and 4, both flame out. Cronin nodded. Feather the affected engines. The 747, now running on only 2, descended through 18,000 feet, then 16. The altimeter spun rapidly, but still the structure held. The crew could not yet see the damage, but they felt it. The controls were sluggish. The airframe vibrated with a rhythmic pulse that suggested torn metal along the forward section. Each time the speed increased, the sound changed pitch, a deep moan echoing through the cabin. Cronin adjusted the throttle to keep the descent steady. Don't overspeed her, he warned quietly. The others knew exactly what he meant. Too much force, and the wounded aircraft could break apart. Somewhere behind the cockpit door, a flight attendant managed to reach the interphone and shout that the forward cabin had been ripped open. The words came through broken, nearly drowned by noise, but they confirmed the crew's fears. Cronin didn't have time to grieve. His focus narrowed to the instruments, the horizon, and the memory of every emergency checklist he had ever practiced. At 10,000 feet, he leveled the aircraft slightly. The air thickened, the temperature rose, and oxygen levels returned to survivable limits. He removed his mask briefly to test the atmosphere. It was cold, thin, but breathable. He left it hanging around his neck and called out, "Masks off if you can." The crew nodded. For the first time since the blast, they could speak clearly to each other. The view through the windshield was black ocean and scattered moonlight. No land, no lights, just the faint reflection of stars on the waves below. Cronin turned to his right. "We're going back to Honolulu." The others agreed instantly. There was nowhere else to go. The plane had lost part of its fuselage and two engines. Turning around was the only option. "Get me a heading," Cronin said. Slater plotted it quickly on the navigation display. 340. Distance about 200 miles. Thomas checked fuel. "We've got plenty. 2 good engines will take us home." They began the turn. The aircraft groaned as it banked, the sound of strained metal filling the cockpit. Cronin spoke to air traffic control again. This time, his voice was clearer. "United 811, declaring emergency. Returning to Honolulu. We've had an explosive decompression, forward fuselage damage, loss of number 3 and 4 engines." Controllers on the ground responded immediately, clearing every other aircraft out of the airspace. Emergency crew scrambled at Honolulu International, preparing for crippled 747 with 355 souls aboard. In the cabin, passengers felt the change in direction, but did not yet know the plan. The intercom crackled, and the calm, authoritative voice of Captain Cronin filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We've had a sudden decompression and some structural damage. We're returning to Honolulu. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." The words, though measured, carried the weight of truth. Every passenger understood that they had just survived something beyond comprehension. Flight attendants moved methodically through the cabin, checking on people, distributing blankets, securing loose items, and comforting those in shock. One passenger later recalled that the attendants' composure gave everyone a thread of hope. If they were still calm, perhaps survival was possible. Back in the cockpit, Cronin faced a new challenge. With 2 engines out, the aircraft's hydraulic systems were partially compromised. The slats and flaps, essential for landing at slower speeds, might not respond evenly. Honolulu was still more than 150 miles away. The question now was not only whether they could reach the airport, but whether the damaged airframe would endure the flight. As they flew northward, the crew went through emergency fuel, jettison procedures to lighten the load. With 2 engines operating, it would take longer to burn fuel, and a heavy aircraft could overshoot the runway or collapse its landing gear upon touchdown. They opened the jettison valves, and a mist of fuel streamed behind them into the night. From the ground, observers later reported a faint trail of shimmering vapor following the aircraft across the ocean. In the cabin, passengers saw nothing of this. Many still sat motionless, wrapped in blankets, hands trembling. Some whispered prayers. Others stared into the dark hole at the front of the plane where their fellow travelers had been. The flight attendants had quietly moved the surviving passengers from the forward rows farther back, away from the cold and the noise. They covered exposed wires and used blankets to reduce the draft. The cockpit crew maintained constant communication with Honolulu. The controllers guided them toward the island, vectoring them onto the most direct route. As they approached within range of radar, the scope operators could finally see the aircraft's blip appear again. Slow, steady, descending. Word spread quickly through the control room. Flight 801 was still airborne. Cronin's focus shifted now to landing. The checklists began again, each line executed with mechanical precision, despite exhaustion. Gear, check. Flaps, as available. Hydraulic pressure, low. Number 2 system only. The flight engineer reported erratic readings from the damaged circuits. Some indicators flickered between green and amber. Cronin knew the instruments could no longer be trusted completely. He had to rely on feel and instinct. At 30 miles out, the island of Oahu appeared ahead, faint city lights reflecting off scattered clouds. For the first time, the crew saw their destination. Honolulu Tower confirmed that all runways were clear and emergency vehicles were standing by. Cronin briefed his crew, "We're coming in with 2 engines, partial flaps. Approach speed will be higher than normal. Brace for possible gear failure or fire." No one flinched. Each of them had made peace with the possibility of the worst. Now they were simply executing their duty. In the cabin, the final descent began. The sound of the engines deepened, and the nose tilted slightly downward. The flight attendants moved quickly, ensuring everyone was belted and braced. "Heads down! Stay down!" they shouted over the roar. Some passengers wept quietly, others closed their eyes. Outside, the lights of Honolulu grew brighter. At 5 miles out, the aircraft's landing gear locked into position, with a metallic thud that echoed through the floor. It was a small miracle. Despite the damage, the gear had deployed. Cronin brought the throttles forward slightly to stabilize airspeed. The approach path lights shimmered ahead, a string of white and red guiding them home. "Speed looks good," Slater called. "Wind calm." "Runway 28 right," Cronin acknowledged. His hands never left the yoke. The windshield reflected the glow of the runway lights now racing toward them. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The 747 touched down harder than usual, tires screeching against asphalt, the fuselage rattling as the weight settled onto the landing gear. Cronin reversed thrust on the 2 working engines, the roar echoing down the runway. Sparks flew from the damaged panels under the nose, but the aircraft slowed steadily. When it finally rolled to a stop, there was a brief, uncanny silence, the first quiet since the explosion. Then came applause cries, and the release of breath held too long. Passengers wept openly. Flight attendants unbuckled and began opening exits for the emergency evacuation. Fire trucks and ambulances surrounded the plane, red and white lights reflecting off its torn metal skin. Only when the crew opened the cockpit door did they see the true extent of the destruction. The forward right section of the fuselage was gone, exposing wiring and insulation. The first rows of seats ended in open air. It looked impossible that the aircraft had remained controllable. Yet it had. As passengers descended the emergency slides and stepped onto the tarmac, many knelt or kissed the ground. Others looked back at the enormous jet that had carried them through hell and lived. Inside the cockpit, Cronin removed his headset and leaned back, eyes closed for a long moment. He had been a pilot for decades, nearing retirement, and in all those years, nothing had tested his skill or spirit like this night. Hours later, as investigators and engineers swarmed around the crippled aircraft, the evidence of what had happened became clearer. The forward cargo door was missing entirely, torn away cleanly from its hinges. Around the edges of the opening, the metal was bent outward, proof that the pressure had come from inside. Scattered fragments of luggage and insulation were recovered from the ocean below. When Boeing engineers examined the actuator system, they found the electrical wires fused together by a short circuit. It was the same flaw that had been implicated in an earlier incident years before. One that had prompted design changes, but not every aircraft had been modified yet. Flight 811 had carried the old design. It was a small oversight with immense consequences. In the weeks that followed, the investigation confirmed what the crew already knew: the sequence leading to the explosion had begun silently, invisibly, deep within the cargo door mechanism. It was not a single act of negligence, but a convergence of physics, engineering, and circumstance. Yet amid that failure, the professionalism of the crew had prevented an even greater tragedy. The final reports would detail every second, every mechanical step, but no words could fully capture the human experience aboard Flight 811, the moment when calm turned to chaos, when survival became a matter of instinct and courage. For those who lived through it, the night of February 24, 1989, would never fade. Even years later, survivors spoke of the sound, that impossible, endless roar, and the sight of the stars through the hole in the fuselage. It was, they said, a glimpse of both death and deliverance at once. The cargo door explosion of Flight 811 became a permanent reminder that in aviation, safety is written in experience, often in blood and survival. Each lesson learned that night reshaped the way aircraft were built and maintained thereafter. And in the silent hours after the emergency landing, as engineers examined the twisted metal under floodlights, Captain Cronin stood beside his aircraft for the last time. He ran a gloved hand over the scarred fuselage and said softly to no one in particular, "She brought us home." It was true. Despite the violent sequence that began with a spark and ended in an explosion, the aircraft and the people within it, had endured. The night sky over the Pacific was once again calm, but its silence would never mean the same again. Somewhere in that vast darkness, the echoes of Flight 8011's struggle remained, a reminder of how quickly routine can turn to disaster, and how courage, training, and sheer will can defy the odds when metal fails and the sky itself seems to open. The moment the forward cargo door tore open and the roar of explosive decompression filled the sky, United Airlines Flight 8011 ceased to be a routine transpacific journey. In the instant that followed, everything familiar inside that Boeing 747 turned alien. The lights flickered, the air howled like a storm, and the aircraft's calm vibration transformed into violent shaking. In the cockpit, Captain David Cronin and his crew were thrust from calm professionalism into a nightmare that demanded instant action. They had only seconds to act, and every decision would mean the difference between survival and destruction. The first priority was oxygen. At that altitude, more than 23,000 feet above the Pacific, the pressure outside was so thin that a human could lose consciousness in less than 15 seconds. The cockpit filled with fog, like mist as the warm air inside met the freezing cold from the ruptured fuselage. Cronin's instincts, sharpened by decades of flying, took over. His hands reached for the yellow oxygen mask hanging beside his seat. The strap snapped into place, and he inhaled sharply, feeling the rush of pure oxygen clear his lungs. Beside him, First Officer Al Slater struggled to pull his own mask on as loose papers and flight checklists flew around the cockpit like leaves in a gale. Flight Engineer Mark Thomas, sitting behind them, reached across the systems panel, his hands shaking, but steady enough to flip the pressurization and power switches that could prevent an electrical overload. The sound of the alarm horns filled the cockpit, loud, repetitive, and relentless. The red cabin altitude warning light flashed on the engineer's panel. In those seconds, the training they had practiced countless times on simulators was no longer theory. It was life itself. Cronin's voice was calm but firm. "Emergency descent," he shouted through the mask. "Get us down." Slater's hand moved to the autopilot control, disconnecting it with a sharp click. The yoke vibrated slightly under his grip. Cronin pushed the control column forward gently, then more decisively, beginning a descent so steep it pressed everyone in their seats. The aircraft, still roaring through the night air, began to nose downward toward the dark ocean below. The descent was not a simple maneuver. It required balancing speed, altitude, and structural stress. The forward section of the aircraft was torn open, exposing wiring, insulation, and parts of the cabin to the freezing night. The wind resistance around that gaping hole created violent turbulence that made the aircraft shudder. Too fast, and the structure could fail completely; too slow, and the descent would stall. Cronin's skill was the only thread keeping the 747 stable. Inside the cabin, the passengers could feel the nose of the aircraft dip sharply downward. The sound of the engines changed pitch as the descent accelerated. People clutched their armrests and braced instinctively. The temperature dropped even further, and the lights flickered as the electrical system compensated for the pressure shock. Through the broken fuselage at the front, the night sky was visible, a black void dotted with stars where seats and passengers had once been. The flight attendants, though terrified, kept moving. Their survival instincts were overridden by their duty to protect the people on board. They crawled along the aisle, pulling oxygen masks onto passengers' faces and shouting commands that were barely audible over the roar of the wind.
"Breathe through the mask! Stay down!"
Some passengers were in shock, others were crying, but everyone could feel the rapid descent as gravity pressed them into their seats. In the cockpit, Cronin maintained focus. His hands gripped the yoke tightly as the airspeed indicator needle climbed past 300 knots. The sound of the rushing air outside grew louder. "Watch the speed," Slater said, glancing at the instrument panel. "Don't let her overspeed." Cronin adjusted the throttles, pulling them back slightly. The response was sluggish. 2 of the 4 engines had already failed. their turbines shredded by debris from the explosion. But the remaining engines roared, keeping the plane alive. Mark Thomas monitored the systems, scanning the instruments for signs of further damage. Hydraulic pressure was dropping, one system showing almost zero. Electrical circuits flickered between readings, their lights switching from green to amber. He called out over the headset, hydraulic number 2 still holding. Number 3 gone. Cronin nodded. That's enough to fly with, keep her steady. The outside world was invisible, no horizon, no land, just the dark ocean somewhere far below. The crew relied solely on their instruments. The altimeter needle wound downward rapidly. 20,000 feet, 18,000, 16,000. The vibrations eased slightly as the cabin pressure equalized. Inside, the fog began to clear. They were descending into thicker air, where oxygen was breathable again. Passing 15,000, Slater reported. Descending to 10. Cronin kept the descent controlled, fighting the natural instinct to dive faster. Every fiber of his experience told him that the wounded aircraft could not take more stress than absolutely necessary. The controls felt heavy, the yoke stiff in his hands. The aerodynamic drag from the hole in the fuselage made the aircraft yaw slightly to the right. He compensated gently, avoiding sudden movements that could worsen the damage. At 10,000 feet, Cronin began to level off. The air pressure outside was now sufficient for passengers to breathe without masks. He tested the air in the cockpit, lifting his mask slightly. It was cold but stable. "We're good here," he said quietly. He unhooked the mask from his face, his voice slightly hoarse from the oxygen flow. "Okay, let's get her under control." The descent had lasted less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes that felt like an eternity. During that time, the crew's combined training and instinct had saved the aircraft from spiraling out of control. They had managed to reduce altitude without losing stability, even with catastrophic structural damage. But now came the next challenge, surviving the flight home. Cronin looked at his instruments and felt the aircraft tremble. 2 engines down, hydraulics partial, pressurization gone. He said aloud, summarizing their situation, "We've got control, but we're not out of it yet." Slater adjusted the engine thrust levers, trimming the aircraft for level flight. Thomas rerouted power from damaged systems to keep essential instruments alive. They were operating on backup generators now. The cabin was a scene of exhaustion and disbelief. The passengers who had survived the explosion were slowly realizing what had happened. The smell of burned wiring and cold metal filled the air. Flight attendants, shivering in the freezing temperature, tried to calm those still panicking. The forward section remained open to the sky, its edges twisted and jagged. The howling of the wind had softened, but the constant noise of the engines reminded everyone how fragile their survival still was. Cronin reached for the radio and called Honolulu Control. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, United 811, explosive decompression. Loss of structure forward, descending to 10,000, requesting immediate return to Honolulu." His tone was steady, but the weight of his words carried urgency. On the ground, air traffic controllers responded instantly, clearing the airspace and coordinating emergency services. The ocean below was invisible in the darkness, but every pilot knew it was there, endless and unforgiving. Cronin had flown for decades, and he knew the Pacific had claimed many aircraft before. But he also knew that calm precision was the only way to beat fear. He adjusted the trim slightly and spoke to his crew, his voice now quieter. "We're going home." The turn back to Honolulu began gently. The damaged plane groaned under the strain of the maneuver, the uneven drag from the missing fuselage section pulling it slightly off balance. Cronin compensated with rudder input, using his foot pedals to keep the wings level. Slater monitored the airspeed closely, making sure it didn't drop too low. They were flying on 2 engines now, numbers 1 and 2, both on the left side. That asymmetry made control even harder. The thrust imbalance constantly tried to yaw the aircraft left, forcing Cronin to correct it every second. Inside the cabin, the descent had given passengers some relief, but fear remained. The temperature was still near freezing in the forward section, and frost had begun forming along the interior walls. The flight attendants handed out blankets and moved survivors away from the damaged area. They used pillows and loose items to block the worst drafts. Some passengers quietly murmured prayers. Others stared blankly at the seat in front of them, too shocked to speak. In the cockpit, the crew worked through the emergency checklist again. Engine 3 and 4 secured, Thomas said. Hydraulic pressure number 2 stable. Electrical bus B isolated. Cronin nodded. He leaned slightly toward the window, trying to see any reflection of the damage outside. But the night hid everything. Only the faint glow of the wing lights revealed the outlines of the engines still running. The flight engineer's panel was littered with warning lights, amber and red signals blinking across every row. The aircraft system computers were struggling to interpret the damage. Some readings contradicted each other. Cronin knew better than to trust them all. Instead, he relied on tactile feedback, the feel of the controls, the vibration in the yoke, the sound of the engines. A pilot's senses could tell him more than instruments ever could when machinery failed. 10 minutes into the descent, Honolulu Control established direct communication. The voice on the radio was calm, almost eerily so. United 811, Honolulu radar contact. Turn left heading 340. You're cleared direct to Honolulu International. Emergency equipment is standing by. Cronin acknowledged. Roger, heading 340. We're maintaining 10,000. For the first time since the explosion, the crew allowed themselves a brief breath of relief. They were no longer alone in the dark. Someone on the ground knew where they were, watching their blip move across the radar screen. But the challenges were far from over. The damaged fuselage created massive aerodynamic drag, reducing the aircraft's performance. Every mile toward Honolulu required constant adjustments. The fuel gauges showed plenty of fuel, but the imbalance caused by losing 2 engines made the flow uneven. The flight engineer began feeding fuel between tanks to maintain stability. The process had to be done carefully. Any mistake could cause a flame out in the remaining engines. As the minutes passed, the horizon began to show a faint glow. The first hint of dawn rising over the Pacific. It was a small sign of hope, a reminder that they were still moving toward land. The crew could not yet see Oahu, but they knew it was ahead. Cronin's mind replayed every emergency he had trained for, and every story of aircraft that never made it back. His determination hardened. She's still flying, he said quietly, almost to himself. We'll get her home. The crew continued monitoring systems as they leveled out. Despite the damage, the Boeing 747 remained remarkably stable. Its enormous wings provided lift even with partial control surfaces. The designers had built redundancy into nearly every system, and on this night, those redundancies were paying off. Still, the pilots could feel that the aircraft was wounded. The controls were heavy, the responses delayed. The yaw damper was likely damaged, forcing Cronin to make constant small corrections to keep the aircraft straight. Below, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly. The glow of dawn began to reveal the faint ripples of waves far below. Inside the cabin, passengers saw the light returning through the windows. A symbol of survival, even though the danger was not yet over. In those tense minutes of the emergency descent, the line between chaos and control blurred. The crew had descended from the edge of catastrophe to a fragile stability. But they all knew that even one wrong input, one sudden gust of turbulence, one engine failure, one electrical short, could end everything. The descent had saved their lives, but it had also tested the limits of human endurance and the resilience of metal against physics. For Cronin, it was no longer just about procedure. It was about instinct, experience, and the unspoken bond between pilots who trust each other's every action. They had survived the descent. Now they had to survive the journey home. The dawn light grew brighter over the Pacific as United Airlines Flight 811 pressed toward Honolulu, its wounded fuselage glinting faintly in the early sun. Inside the cockpit, Captain David Cronin adjusted his seat and wiped the condensation from his visor. The roar of wind had softened, but the low hum of vibration remained, a reminder that the giant aircraft was still far from safe. The forward cargo door section had been ripped away, taking a portion of the cabin with it, and though the immediate threat of decompression had passed, the structural damage continued to challenge the crew at every mile. First Officer Al Slater scanned the navigation instruments. Their radar screen showed only the empty void of the Pacific. 75 miles to Honolulu, he reported through his headset. Radar contact is strong. We're cleared direct. Cronin nodded, his eyes on the fuel gauges and engine indicators. 2 engines were all they had to depend on, both on the same wing. That asymmetry made every turn delicate. The controls responded slowly, as if the airplane were resisting their every move. In the flight engineer's panel, Mark Thomas continued to monitor the system readings. Hydraulic system 2 still held pressure, though the fluid temperature was rising. The cabin pressure gauge was flatlined. He made a quick notation in his log, automatic habit. Even in crisis, his handwriting trembled slightly. Cabin unpressurized, power on essential bus only. He looked up and said, "Captain, hydraulics steady for now. But we can't use the outboard spoilers, they're dead." Cronin replied quietly, "We'll land long if we have to." His tone was calm, almost detached, but his mind was racing ahead to every detail of the approach. A crippled 747 heavy with fuel, no pressurization, limited control surfaces, and damaged structure. It would take every ounce of skill to bring it back alive. Down in the passenger cabin, the atmosphere hovered between exhaustion and disbelief. Some passengers clutched one another's hands, others stared blankly at the floor. The noise had become a steady roar, like a storm in the distance. Through the open forward fuselage, light seeped in from the rising sun, glinting off twisted aluminum. The flight attendants moved methodically, gathering debris, checking seat belts, securing what little they could. Their faces were pale but determined. One of them, Senior Attendant Jane Cyril, made her way forward with difficulty, gripping the seatbacks for balance. She reached the first-class section, now half destroyed, and looked out through the hole in the fuselage. Cold air blasted her face. She turned away, tears forming in her eyes, and whispered, "We have to make it back." She knew some of her colleagues and passengers were gone, torn from their seats in that first violent instant. There was no time to process it, only time to survive. In the cockpit the radio crackled. United 811, Honolulu. Confirmed souls on board and fuel remaining. Cronin answered evenly. Approximately 355 souls on board. Fuel remaining 120,000 pounds. 2 engines operating. The controller acknowledged with a quiet, "Roger, United 811. Runway 8, left in use, cleared for priority approach. Emergency vehicles are standing by." The captain nodded slowly. The words, "emergency vehicles," carried a strange comfort, someone waiting for them, ready to help. He glanced to his right. "Okay, Al, we'll stay at 10,000 until 20 miles, then start a slow descent to pattern altitude. Keep the speed under 280 do." Slater adjusted the throttles, his movements gentle, almost reverent. Every control input was calculated, measured, deliberate. The early light revealed the ocean below, endless, calm, indifferent. The horizon began to show the faint outline of Oahu, a dark mass rising from the blue. The sight drew a quiet exhale from everyone in the cockpit. After nearly 20 minutes of uncertainty, land was visible again. But even now, the danger remained immediate. The damaged forward section acted like an open scoop, creating drag that wanted to pitch the nose downward. Cronin fought it subtly, using trim adjustments to balance the forces. Inside, the passengers felt the gradual descent begin again. Some thought it was over, others gripped their seats in renewed fear. The flight attendants announced over the PA system, their voices shaky but composed, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are returning to Honolulu. Please remain seated, seat belts fastened, and follow all crew instructions." The cabin erupted into a low murmur, relief mixed with dread. As they approached the island, Honolulu Control transferred them to the approach frequency. The voice on the radio was smooth, professional, and unwavering. United 811, descend and maintain 3,000 feet. You are cleared to enter left downwind for runway 8, left. Cronin acknowledged. The island now filled the windshield, lush and green, surrounded by the glimmering ocean. The captain could see the morning light touching the mountains near Pearl Harbor. He took a slow breath. We'll make one pass if we can, but we're landing on the first attempt. His hands flexed on the yoke. If we lose hydraulics or another engine, that's it. Slater nodded, eyes scanning the instruments. The approach path was clear. Fire trucks and emergency crews were already positioned along the runway, their red lights flashing faintly in the distance. The crew reviewed the emergency landing checklist one last time. Gear will be manual, Thomas said, pointing to the alternate gear handle. We've got partial hydraulics, but I don't trust it. Cronin agreed. Deploy manually when I call it. The thought of landing gear failure was another silent fear. They could not afford to come down on the fuselage. At 5,000 feet, the descent grew rougher. The airflow over the damaged nose caused buffeting, making the aircraft shudder violently. Cronin gritted his teeth and held steady. Ride it through, he said. Don't fight the turbulence. The 747, heavy but loyal, obeyed his touch. For a moment it almost seemed alive, a machine willing itself to survive alongside its pilots. The island loomed larger now. Beaches, roads, and buildings came into view. The passengers could see the coastline approaching. Some began to cry quietly, others clutched their neighbors' hands tighter. The cabin crew moved one last time, checking every belt, securing loose objects. They crouched near their jump seats, ready for whatever came next. In the cockpit, the final approach began. Flaps 10, Cronin ordered. The flap lever resisted slightly, then moved. The response on the indicator was slow. Hydraulic pressure barely enough. Flaps moving, Slater confirmed. The added lift stabilized their descent rate. Thomas reached for the manual gear lever and pulled. There was a mechanical groan, then a heavy thud beneath the floor. 3 green, he announced. Gear down and locked. Cronin allowed himself one brief moment of relief. Okay, let's bring her home. The aircraft turned gently toward the runway. The airspeed held steady at 180 knots. Smoke from the city's early morning chimneys drifted below them. The approach was perfectly aligned. Yet, even in that moment, danger remained. The damaged nose caused uneven airflow over the wings. The control surfaces were sluggish. Every correction took seconds to take effect. Cronin anticipated them with the precision of instinct, guiding the aircraft not by numbers but by feel. 2 miles. Slater called. Altitude 600. Cronin tightened his grip on the yoke. Landing checklist complete, Thomas said. Cronin nodded once. We're committed. The runway stretched ahead, an endless strip of black asphalt surrounded by green grass and flashing emergency lights. At 400 feet, the aircraft began to drift slightly right. Cronin corrected with gentle rudder input. The heavy plane responded slowly, then steadied. Hold her, Slater whispered. You've got it. Cronin's eyes never left the runway. We're good. The altimeter ticked downward. 200 feet, 100. The ground approached fast. Cronin eased back on the yoke, flaring slightly. The main landing gear touched the runway with a deep, solid thump. The sound echoed through the cabin like a heartbeat. The nose wheel came down hard, shaking the flight deck. The brakes engaged. The aircraft slowed but pulled slightly to the left, hydraulic pressure uneven. Cronin compensated with rudder, keeping it straight. Smoke trailed from the landing gear as the massive jet slowed, the emergency vehicles pacing alongside with sirens muted. After what felt like forever, the speed dropped below 80 knots. Cronin eased the throttles to idle. We're down, he said softly. We're safe. Applause broke out in the cabin, uncontrollable, emotional, raw. People sobbed openly, clinging to one another. The crew sat frozen for a moment, disbelief mixing with exhaustion. Slater took a long breath. Good job, Dave. Cronin simply nodded, eyes still fixed ahead. "Let's get everyone out." They taxied off the runway slowly, guided by emergency vehicles. Foam trucks followed in formation. The aircraft's damage was visible even from the ground, metal torn, wiring exposed, paint scorched by friction. Yet it had made it home. The Boeing 747, though broken, had proven its strength. When the engines finally shut down, the sudden silence felt almost surreal. The only sound was the faint ticking of cooling metal. Flight attendants opened the doors and began the evacuation. Passengers moved down the slides into the bright Hawaiian morning, stepping onto solid ground with trembling legs. Some kissed the tarmac. Others looked back at the massive jet, realizing only then the magnitude of what they had survived. Emergency crews rushed aboard to assess injuries and stabilize the structure. Cronin stood by the open cockpit door for a moment, watching passengers exit. The adrenaline that had carried him through the past hour began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of disbelief. He turned to his crew. "Good work, everyone. We did what we had to." On the ground, investigators and airline officials would soon swarm the aircraft, photographing every inch, measuring the damage, collecting debris. But for those inside, the technical details could wait. For now, it was about being alive. Later, as Cronin stepped down the stairs to the runway, the warm air hit his face. Reporters and emergency staff stood nearby, cameras flashing, but he barely noticed. He looked back at the aircraft, its nose torn open like a wound, its fuselage dented and burned. The sight was haunting yet awe-inspiring. "She held together," he said quietly to no one in particular. She really held together. That morning, Honolulu's airport became a symbol of quiet heroism. Every person on that flight carried a story of fear, courage, and endurance. The crew's quick thinking and calm under pressure had prevented a catastrophe that could have echoed across aviation history as one of its darkest chapters. In the following hours, emergency teams retrieved the bodies of the 9 passengers who had been lost when the cargo door exploded. Their absence was a wound that no survival story could fully heal. Yet their loss gave meaning to the lessons learned, the need to understand why such a disaster could happen, and how to prevent it again. The National Transportation Safety Board would later discover that a faulty design in the cargo door latching system had caused the explosive decompression. Electrical wiring near the door's actuator had short-circuited, forcing the door to open outward under pressure. It was a known issue, one that had already caused incidents on other 747s. But on this night it had turned deadly. The accident would lead to global redesigns of cargo door mechanisms across the aviation industry. For Captain Cronin, the events of that night remained etched in memory. He retired soon after, his final flight one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of professionalism ever recorded. In interviews, he rarely spoke about fear. He spoke instead about teamwork, about the importance of calm, and about trusting training when everything else fails. "You don't think about dying," he once said quietly. "You think about flying the airplane." Decades later, United Flight 811 remains a story told not only in aviation circles but in classrooms, documentaries, and training simulators worldwide. It stands as a testament to the human ability to face chaos and bring order, to keep faith in mettle, skill, and discipline even when the odds collapse. The aircraft that landed that morning was more than a machine, it was a vessel of resilience, carrying the lives of hundreds who refused to surrender to fear. As the sun climbed higher over Honolulu that day, the broken jet sat quietly on the tarmac, surrounded by fire trucks and investigators. The light gleamed off its torn metal, transforming destruction into reflection. Somewhere inside that silence was the echo of a descent that had started in terror and ended in survival. And in that echo lay the essence of aviation itself, the pursuit of control, courage, and calm amid the impossible. For the crew of Flight 811, it was the longest hour of their lives, an hour that tested every skill they possessed and every instinct they had honed. For those who study the story, it remains a lesson in leadership under pressure, proof that even when the sky explodes around you, determination can still guide a crippled machine safely home. And so, the story of Flight 811's emergency descent ends not with tragedy alone, but with triumph, a fragile, hard-won triumph born from professionalism, unity, and faith in flight. The investigation that followed the emergency landing of United Airlines Flight 811 became one of the most detailed and emotional inquiries in modern aviation history. As the wreckage sat in the morning sun on the tarmac of Honolulu International Airport, teams of engineers, investigators, and safety experts began piecing together what had caused the terrifying event in the skies over the Pacific. The damage told a story written in twisted metal and torn wiring, a story of design flaws, overlooked warnings, and the razor-thin line between catastrophe and survival. The forward cargo door, the focus of every eye, had been blown outward, tearing open a hole nearly 10 feet wide. The engineers from Boeing examined the locking mechanism, noting how the latches, which should have sealed inward under pressure, had failed. The locking sector, a heavy steel component meant to secure the door against explosive forces, was found bent and deformed, as if pried from the inside. Investigators quickly determined that the door had not simply burst open from internal pressure alone. Something had triggered its latch to unlock mid-flight. In the hangar where the remains of the cargo door were laid out, technicians found burn marks on electrical wiring leading to the door's actuator motor. These wires were part of the control system that powered the mechanical locks. The insulation was charred, the copper exposed. It appeared that an electrical short circuit had sent an unintended signal to the actuator, causing it to rotate and release the door latches. Once the first latch moved, the pressure differential between the pressurized cabin and the thin air outside took over, exploding the door outward and ripping open the fuselage in less than a second. The discovery echoed another incident years earlier, when a Pan Am 747 had experienced a similar cargo door failure, though without loss of life. At that time, recommendations for a redesign had been made, but changes were slow to reach the entire fleet. Flight 811 became the grim reminder of what happens when warnings are not acted upon swiftly. The Safety Board's report would later emphasize this chain of missed opportunities, a pattern that stretched across manufacturers, airlines, and regulatory agencies. For the families of the 9 passengers who had been ejected from the plane, the technical details were only part of the truth. They wanted answers that spoke to accountability. Why had a known defect not been fixed? Why were crews not informed about the electrical vulnerabilities in the cargo door circuits? The questions resonated through every hearing, every press conference, and every written page of the final report. As investigators continued, Boeing engineers worked alongside the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, to recreate the failure in simulation. In laboratory conditions, they replicated the sequence, a short circuit sending current to the actuator motor while the aircraft was at altitude. In each test, the latch rotated exactly as it had on Flight 811, unlocking despite safety pins being in place. The tests confirmed the root cause beyond doubt. The results led to sweeping reforms. Boeing redesigned the 747's cargo door mechanism to include stronger locking sectors and better electrical isolation, ensuring that no single electrical fault could override the mechanical locks. Airlines worldwide were ordered to retrofit their fleets, and inspection protocols were rewritten to include direct checks of the cargo door systems before each long-haul flight. The changes rippled through the industry, improving safety not only for Boeing but for every manufacturer that studied the lessons learned from Flight 811. Back in Honolulu, the crew of Flight 811 cooperated fully with investigators. Captain David Cronin, nearing retirement, spent hours recounting every second of the event. The sounds, the vibrations, the moment the decompression hit. His calm precision in describing it impressed even the investigators. One NTSB member later remarked that his professionalism had likely saved hundreds of lives. Cronin's logbook would record this as one of his final flights, a testament to the power of training and composure under unimaginable stress. The flight attendants were also interviewed, their stories filled with courage and heartbreak. They described the chaos of the decompression, the fight against wind and freezing air, and the helplessness of seeing part of the cabin ripped away. Their bravery became a quiet symbol of aviation's human side, the strength of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in moments of crisis. When the final report was published, it concluded that the cause of the accident was an electrical short circuit that led to inadvertent opening of the forward cargo door, resulting in explosive decompression and structural damage. It cited inadequate implementation of safety modifications and insufficient oversight as contributing factors. The language was technical but carried an unmistakable weight. Behind every sentence lay the memory of the lives lost and the near disaster that followed. In the years that came after, aviation schools and training programs began using the Flight 811 case as a study in system redundancy and human performance. It became a model example of how multiple small failures, mechanical, procedural, and regulatory, can align to create a catastrophe. Yet it also stood as an example of how skill and discipline can pull an aircraft back from the brink. Today, when pilots train for decompression emergencies or system failures, they unknowingly echo the same procedures Cronin and his crew followed that night. Every simulation that teaches calm under pressure, every check that prevents a mechanical fault carries a trace of Flight 811's legacy. The disaster reshaped not just engineering, but the philosophy of flight safety itself, that no warning, however small, should ever be ignored. Standing on the tarmac years later, long after his retirement, Cronin once reflected quietly to a journalist, "We were lucky, yes. But luck only matters if you're ready for it." His words captured what Flight 811 ultimately represented, not just the tragedy of failure, but the resilience of those who turned it into progress. The plane that almost didn't make it became a lesson for every flight that followed, reminding the world that even out of destruction, safety can be reborn. The legacy of United Airlines Flight 811 remains etched in aviation history as both a warning and a turning point. What happened that night above the Pacific was more than a technical failure. It was a moment that reshaped how the world thought about safety, accountability, and human endurance in the skies. Long after the twisted metal had been cleared away and the official reports filed, the story of Flight 811 continued to echo through hangars, classrooms, and cockpits around the world. It became not only a case study in engineering and investigation, but also a tribute to the resilience of those who lived through it, and the lives that were lost in those few dark minutes. The airline industry, often driven by innovation and technology, was forced to look inward after the tragedy. The complacency that had allowed old designs and known issues to persist was no longer acceptable. Boeing engineers, shaken by the discovery of their design flaw, led a complete overhaul of the cargo door systems on every 747 still in service. They strengthened the locking sectors, improved the wiring insulation, and introduced new indicators to warn pilots if a door was not fully secured. These changes spread far beyond one company. Other aircraft manufacturers studied the same systems and applied similar safeguards, ensuring that a single electrical fault could never again lead to such devastation. But the most profound change was not in the machinery. It was in the mindset. Regulators and safety boards began to understand that aviation safety was not just about machines, it was about communication, transparency, and culture. The NTSB's recommendations after Flight 811 emphasized that known hazards, no matter how minor, must be reported and resolved immediately. Airlines were instructed to keep detailed records of every maintenance report, every electrical issue, and every part replacement. The message was simple but vital: no risk is too small to ignore. For the surviving passengers, life after the incident was a mixture of gratitude and trauma. Many struggled to return to flying, haunted by the sound of tearing metal and the rush of freezing air. Some became advocates for safety reform, sharing their experiences publicly to ensure that others would never face what they endured. In interviews, they often described a strange paradox. the fear that lingered from the flight, and the deep appreciation for life that came with survival. Their voices added a human dimension to a story too easily buried under technical data and engineering diagrams. Captain David Cronin became a reluctant hero. He was nearing retirement when Flight 8011 tested every ounce of his experience and calm. His actions that night, descending an unresponsive jumbo jet with 2 failed engines and a gaping hole in its fuselage, were later described by aviation experts as textbook precision under chaos. He often downplayed his heroism, crediting his crew and training instead. Yet among pilots, his name became synonymous with professionalism. Many flight schools began teaching the Cronin approach, the art of staying composed when every alarm blares and every second counts. The memory of the 9 passengers who were lost also became an integral part of aviation's conscience. Memorials were held across the world, from Japan to the United States, for the lives that ended so abruptly. Their absence became the silent reminder behind every safety upgrade, every new regulation, every pre-flight inspection. In aviation, safety regulations are often written in the memory of those who did not make it home, and Flight 8011 was no exception. Each change carried their legacy, turning their tragedy into a safeguard for others. As years passed, the lessons of Flight 8011 continued to influence policy. The Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) mandated stricter oversight of aircraft modifications and required manufacturers to demonstrate fail-safe designs for every critical component. Airlines were required to update maintenance procedures, focusing especially on electrical systems that could trigger mechanical operations. These new standards saved countless lives in the years that followed. It was a quiet success born from disaster. In the broader picture of aviation history, Flight 8011 joined the ranks of other transformative events, the kind that define an era and push technology to evolve. From the fiery lessons of early jet crashes to the mysteries of mid-air explosions, each disaster added a page to the story of human progress. What distinguished Flight 8011 was the combination of human survival and engineering revelation. It proved that even when technology fails, the discipline, teamwork, and courage of people can hold the line between life and death. Documentaries, books, and training videos would later revisit the flight, analyzing each second from takeoff to touchdown. The cabin footage, the radar transcripts, and the cockpit voice recordings were used not to sensationalize, but to educate. For every new pilot learning to manage decompression or electrical failure, Flight 811 became a living lesson, a real-world scenario that underscored why checklists, communication, and decision-making mattered more than anything. In the end, Flight 8011 stands as a symbol of balance between tragedy and triumph. It exposed flaws, demanded reform, and ultimately made flying safer for millions. The story closes not with despair, but with reflection. The same skies that witnessed fear and destruction also saw resilience and renewal. From that night in 1989 to the present day, every aircraft that climbs through the clouds carries a part of its legacy, a quiet testament to human determination and the relentless pursuit of safety. The story of Flight 8011 extends far beyond metal, engineering, and statistics. Its true legacy lies in the profound effect it had on aviation culture, human psychology, and the global understanding of safety in the skies. The events of that fateful night demonstrated how human courage, decision-making under extreme stress, and teamwork could alter the course of what might have been an unimaginable tragedy. Pilots, flight attendants, passengers, and investigators all became part of a complex human system, one that relied on trust, training, and instinct to navigate chaos. Inside the cockpit, Captain David Cronin and his crew became the embodiment of this human factor. Every reaction, every choice, was informed by years of experience, practice, and instinct. The decompression had occurred within seconds, and the violent shaking of the aircraft left no margin for error. Cronin's ability to control the aircraft, to descend safely, and to communicate calmly with both his crew and air traffic control reflected an extraordinary combination of technical mastery and psychological resilience. For investigators and pilots alike, this moment became a prime example of how cognitive control in high-stress situations can override fear and allow survival against incredible odds. The flight attendants, too, played a critical role in shaping the human response to the disaster. Their presence and leadership during the chaos demonstrated that survival is as much about psychological calm as it is about procedure. Guiding passengers through the panic, administering oxygen, and maintaining order amid the deafening noise of wind and engines exemplified a profound application of crisis management. Flight attendants are trained for emergencies, but real events test the limits of training. On Flight 811, their courage under pressure highlighted the importance of clear communication, assertiveness, and emotional control, providing passengers with anchors of stability in a moment of terrifying uncertainty. Passengers' experiences further underscored the psychological dimension of the incident. The sudden decompression and loss of the forward fuselage induced fear that went beyond the physical threat. It triggered a primal survival response. Some passengers froze in shock, while others acted instinctively to secure themselves and those around them. The collective behavior of the passengers was a microcosm of human survival psychology: fear, cooperation, panic, and decision-making all interacting under extreme conditions. Researchers studying the incident later noted that the presence of calm and confident crew members significantly reduced the number of injuries and prevented greater loss of life, proving that leadership and human behavior are inseparable from the technical aspects of aviation safety. Flight 811 also became a catalyst for systemic change in aviation safety culture. Prior to the incident, some airlines and manufacturers had a tendency to rely on technical fixes alone, assuming that procedures and training could compensate for design flaws. The explosion and subsequent investigation exposed the dangers of this approach. Organizations around the world began to emphasize a holistic view of aviation safety, one that combined engineering, human factors, training, and proactive communication. Safety culture shifted from reactive problem-solving to anticipatory prevention, with the understanding that small lapses could lead to catastrophic outcomes. The incident also transformed regulatory approaches globally. Authorities recognize that no system is infallible and that human oversight, redundancy, and vigilance are essential. Mandatory inspections, improved design standards, and stricter adherence to maintenance protocols were enforced across multiple aircraft fleets. The lesson was clear: human vigilance is as critical as engineering precision. Safety was no longer solely a matter of machinery. It was a shared responsibility that involved pilots, engineers, regulators, and passengers alike. Psychologically, Flight 811 left a lasting imprint on how humans perceive risk in aviation. Survivors described a heightened awareness of mechanical systems, a respect for procedures, and a recognition of their own psychological limits. Many passengers reported a new appreciation for the skill required to operate commercial aircraft safely, and a deep understanding of how small decisions and prompt actions can prevent disaster. Pilots and crew who trained using Flight 811 scenarios learned not only the technical procedures, but also the importance of mental preparation, stress inoculation, and situational awareness, lessons that extended to every emergency scenario, from turbulence to engine failure. In training programs that emerged from the analysis of Flight 811, scenarios were designed to simulate high-pressure, rapidly evolving emergencies. Pilots were taught to rely on instruments when visibility and instinct conflicted, to maintain composure despite conflicting warnings, and to prioritize decisions that could preserve life over technical perfection. Flight attendants received enhanced modules on psychological management, including techniques to calm panicked passengers and maintain operational control under duress. Together, these educational reforms reinforce the idea that survival in aviation is not only about mechanics, but about mental acuity, teamwork, and leadership. Flight 811 also served as a reminder of the interconnectedness of global aviation systems. The rapid response from air traffic control, the readiness of emergency services, and the cooperation among international safety bodies highlighted the importance of coordination and communication. Every part of the system, from the cockpit to the ground, had a role in mitigating risk. The incident became a template for international safety collaboration, showing that human factors, procedural rigor, and global standards are inseparable in preventing disaster. Ultimately, the legacy of Flight 8011 in aviation culture is both cautionary and inspirational. It demonstrates that while machines can fail, human skill and collaboration can prevent the failure from becoming a catastrophe. It underscores that psychological resilience, training, and trust in one another are as critical as the structural integrity of an aircraft. For pilots, crew, engineers, and passengers alike, the story is a reminder that calm, decisive action under pressure is the ultimate safeguard. Flight 8011's influence continues to permeate modern aviation. The lessons learned have informed the design of newer aircraft, improved training programs, and strengthened global safety protocols. It stands as a testament to human ingenuity and courage, a story where survival was not a matter of chance but of preparation, discipline, and the ability to remain composed when the sky itself seemed to fall apart. The memory of that flight lives on in every simulator, every cockpit, and every airline that prioritizes not only mechanical safety, but also the human capacity to navigate the impossible. The story of United Airlines Flight 8011 did not end with the emergency landing or the investigation that followed. Its final chapter lies in its enduring impact on modern aviation, the lessons learned, and the remembrance of those whose lives were forever altered. The incident became a pivotal moment in history, reminding the world that even in an era of advanced technology, human vigilance, preparation, and courage remain paramount. The narrative of Flight 8011 has since informed aircraft design, airline operations, pilot and crew training, and public awareness of aviation safety, leaving an indelible mark on the industry. Following the investigation, aviation authorities worldwide began integrating the lessons of Flight 811 into regulations and standards. Cargo door mechanisms, once considered reliable, were redesigned to prevent single-point failures. Electrical wiring around critical systems was re-evaluated, and redundancies were increased to ensure that no single fault could trigger catastrophic consequences. Airlines instituted more rigorous pre-flight checks, with a renewed focus on verifying the integrity of doors, hatches, and other potential points of failure. The changes, while technical, reflected a broader shift in philosophy. Safety could not be assumed, and every precaution had to be proactive rather than reactive. Beyond engineering, Flight 811 influenced how airlines prepared crews for emergencies. The incident became a case study in simulator training programs, with pilots practicing scenarios involving decompression, rapid descents, and system failures. Flight attendants were trained to manage passenger panic, administer oxygen effectively, and coordinate evacuation under extraordinary circumstances. The story reinforced the importance of teamwork, communication, and leadership in ensuring survival when the aircraft itself becomes unpredictable. By simulating the high-pressure environment of Flight 811, airlines could instill a level of confidence and preparedness that no checklist alone could provide. The psychological impact of the event also resonated throughout aviation. Survivors reported lingering anxiety, hyper-awareness of cabin procedures, and a profound respect for crew expertise. For many, flying again required not only technical reassurance, but also emotional resilience. The incident highlighted how human psychology interacts with mechanical failures, emphasizing that mental preparation is as critical as technical skill. Airlines and training institutions began incorporating psychological readiness into their programs, teaching crews to manage fear and stress while making rapid, high-stakes decisions. Flight 8011 became a blueprint for understanding how humans react in extreme scenarios and how training can channel instinct into effective action. Flight 8011 also left a lasting cultural imprint on the aviation community. Its story is told in documentaries, books, and safety seminars not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor resilience. The aircraft, though damaged, became a symbol of human skill overcoming potential disaster. The crew's courage, decisiveness, and collaboration became a benchmark for professionalism, inspiring generations of pilots and flight attendants. Safety officers and investigators frequently reference Flight 811 as a turning point, demonstrating how a single event can catalyze broad improvements across the industry. Memorials for the passengers who were lost in the explosion serve as solemn reminders of the human cost of aviation failures. Their memory motivates the continuous pursuit of better safety standards and fosters a culture where every precaution is taken seriously. Families, advocates, and organizations have worked to ensure that these lives are never forgotten, and their legacy continues to shape policy and education within aviation circles. Every design improvement, every procedural update, carries with it a tribute to those who perished, reinforcing the moral responsibility inherent in air travel. The influence of Flight 811 extended beyond the immediate airline and manufacturer. Regulatory bodies like the Federal Aviation Administration (AFAA) and the National Transportation Safety Board (NTSB) revised their oversight processes, mandating more frequent inspections, stricter adherence to manufacturer recommendations, and independent verification of critical systems. International aviation organizations adopted similar measures, creating a global ripple effect in safety standards. Flight 811 underscored that aviation is a global enterprise where lessons from one incident can prevent tragedies across the world. In practical terms, modern aircraft and airlines operate under safety regimes shaped by Flight 811. Cargo door mechanisms are now virtually fail-safe, decompression protocols are rigorous, and cockpit systems incorporate multiple redundancies. Crew coordination, emergency descent procedures, and passenger management techniques have all evolved based on the insights gleaned from that night over the Pacific. Every time a plane descends safely under duress or a crew handles an in-flight emergency efficiently, echoes of Flight 811's lessons can be felt, silently guiding decisions and actions. Flight 811 also changed public perception of aviation risk. While flying remains statistically safe, the incident reminded the world that even routine flights could involve unforeseen dangers. It highlighted the interplay between human skill, mechanical reliability, and procedural vigilance, and reinforced the idea that safety is a shared responsibility among manufacturers, regulators, crews, and passengers. The awareness cultivated by this story has contributed to a culture where reporting, compliance, and attention to detail are valued above convenience or assumption. Today, Flight 811 is studied not only for its technical aspects but also for the human stories it encompasses. The bravery of the crew, the fortitude of the passengers, and the diligence of investigators together form a narrative that transcends the event itself. It illustrates how preparation, courage, and coordinated action can transform near-certain disaster into survival and learning. The story continues to inspire pilots, engineers, and safety professionals, serving as a living testament to the critical balance between human decision-making and technological reliability. Ultimately, the seventh keynote of Flight 811's story emphasizes continuity, remembrance, and progress. The aircraft's emergency descent, the resilience of the crew, and the lessons drawn from investigation have left a permanent imprint on aviation culture. Modern safety standards, training programs, and operational protocols all reflect the knowledge gained from that night. Flight 811 reminds the world that in aviation, as in life, tragedy and triumph are often inseparable, and that every lesson learned contributes to a safer and more aware future for all who take to the skies.